When we move into the world of Flannery O'Connor, we move into a world of a woman who was a devout Irish Catholic, but living in the evangelical South. Baptism, Southern Baptism, and Presbyterianism, Protestantism, Calvinism, Southern Calvinism were really the dominant faiths. But her faith and its theology were central to her life and her work. And because she was Catholic, she saw things to some extent really as an outsider would. Her best-known story is A Good Man is Hard to Find. The essential outline of the story is a family of four, including Bailey and his wife, referred to only as the children's mother, and their two children, John Wesley and June Starr, and a character simply known as the grandmother, who is Bailey's mother. They go on a road trip to Florida, though the grandmother wants to go to Tennessee. Before they go, the grandmother mentions an escapee, a serial killer or mass murderer who calls himself the Misfit. She also surreptitiously takes along her cat, hidden in a basket under her valise. The family stops at a barbecue sandwich place called The Tower, run by a character who calls himself Red Sammy. And the grandmother again mentions the Misfit, this time to Red Sammy, and the two converse. We get the title of the story. Two fellas come in here last week, Red Sammy said, driving a Chrysler. It was an old beat-up car, but it was a good one. And these boys looked all right to me. Said they worked at the mill, and I let them fellers charge the gas they bought. Now, why did I do that? Because you're a good man, the grandmother said at once. Yes'm, I suppose so, Red Sam said, as if he were struck with an answer. His wife brought the orders, carrying the 5 plates all at once without a tray, 2 in each hand and 1 balanced on her arm, and notice again the attention to detail there. It isn't a soul in this green world of God's that you can trust, she said, and I don't count nobody out of that. Not nobody, she repeated, looking at Red Sammy. Did you read about that criminal, the Misfit, that's escaped? Asked the grandmother. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if he didn't attack this place right here, said the woman. If he hears about it being here, I wouldn't be none surprised to see him. If he hears it's 2 cents in the cash register, I wouldn't be at all surprised if he... That'll do, Red Sam said. Go bring these people their Coca-Colas. And the woman went off to get the rest of the order. A good man is hard to find, Red Sammy said. Everything is getting terrible. I remember the day you could go off and leave your screen door unlatched. Not no more. Now this seems like, well, especially in retrospect, a little bit of a deviation from the storyline, but in many ways, of course, it not only heightens that sense of what is a good man and brings us to that question, which is at the core of the story. Because Red Sammy doesn't appear to be all that good a man, the way he treats his wife, and he speaks as if he's some kind of a victim, but clearly he's a man who the grandmother is telling is a good man when we're seeing him, well, in a nuanced way, is not such a good man, as I said. And later on, when the grandmother meets the Misfit, which she does, all of this presentiment, all of this foreshadowing, mentioning the Misfit at the start, mentioning the Misfit with Red Sammy, comes to us not as such a surprise, but nevertheless, this is where O'Connor takes us eventually. We go back on the road, and the grandmother gets nostalgic. She remembers an old plantation, and through telling the children about a house with secret panels and silver treasure hidden when Sherman marched in, she lures them into persuading Bailey, their father, to take a turn onto a dirt road where the cat suddenly bounds out of a basket onto Bailey's shoulder, causing the car to turn over. The family then encounters 3 men, and the grandmother flags them down. She recognizes the Misfit, who is with 2 of his henchmen, and announces her recognition of him, which of course turns out to be perhaps a fatal mistake. Misfit, however, gets into a deep theological discussion with the grandmother, while he sees to it that the children's mother, Bailey, and the 2 children are taken off into the woods by his henchmen and murdered. The grandmother tells the Misfit that he is one of her babies, touches him on the shoulder, and the Misfit shoots her, saying she would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. O'Connor made clear her intention in A Good Man is Hard to Find, and we always should be a little skeptical about authors giving us their own intentions, especially short story writers. They are, after all, fiction writers, and they can fictionalize their motives just as well as anything else. But this is her most famous and her most anthologized short story. It's a story that got a great deal of attention during her own life. And what she said she wanted to show was mystery and a moment of grace for the grandmother, when she suddenly touches the Misfit and calls him one of her children, one of her babies. O'Connor wrote of this being the right gesture and of grace occurring. And she believed, and because she's written about this and certainly spoken about it in her lifetime, that moments of violence and terror are when grace can occur, when we face imminent death. Well, those intentions notwithstanding, the story can also be read as one of existential despair or of nihilism. A whole family is slaughtered by a killer in a setting described as having neither sun nor cloud. But theological mystery abounds in this story. Remember, this is a devout Roman Catholic writing about, essentially, Protestants. But the grandmother, from the beginning of the story, speaks about the misfit with anxiety. And then she meets up with him. She identifies him. She ensures the destruction of the entire family and raises questions concerning, as we saw in the lottery, the nature and the movement of fate. But there are deeper theological questions. The grandmother has a dialogue with the misfit. There's a lot of musing that goes on from the misfit, who clearly wants to understand the miracles that have been attributed to Jesus, such as raising the dead. And while he's speaking about such matters, the grandmother is importuning him to pray and to let Jesus into his heart, and saying, I know you won't harm me because I'm a lady, and I know you don't have common blood. Reinforcing to some extent the kinds of things she said to Red Sammy at his barbecue, saying to the misfit, you're a good man, you're not going to harm me. But the misfit, of course, is a killer. And we find out perhaps some of the mysteriousness behind why the misfit is a killer, and we find out why the grandmother can and indeed perhaps will face the possibility of grace. O'Connor said her intention with the misfit was to make him a prophet gone bad. But he's often been, and really can be identified in some ways as a satanic figure, as well as death itself. There are a number of things he says about, not paying the mortician and so forth that make him seem like he is death itself. There's a devouring dragon by the side of the road in the epigram in the story from St. Cyril. Maybe the misfit is that devouring dragon that one has to pass through or get past, really. The woods are described by O'Connor in the story as tall, dark, and deep, and harken back to the mysteriousness of the evil woods in Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown. But the whole question of evil, particularly as it applies to theology and belief and faith, has to do with the punishment and of Jesus setting, the punishment that the misfit feels that he's endured through his life, and of Jesus, as he says, setting things off balance. Why does the misfit say Jesus set things off balance? Because we are unable to determine if he really raised the dead, for example. For all of her talk of Jesus, the grandmother is blathering, mainly trying to save her own skin. Though she does suddenly utter that perhaps Jesus did not raise the dead. There's that moment where she loses her faith, or seems to lose her faith. And yet when she touches the misfit, it does seem to be, or appear to be, in connection with O'Connor's intentions, a moment of grace. At the story's end, she is like a child. She's smiling up at the cloudless sky. O'Connor said that at the heart of her fiction was mystery and manners. Mystery is tied to grace, is tied to belief in Catholic faith and theology. Manners were based on folkways, idioms, characters identifiably Southern. The grandmother is a Southern lady, an archetypal figure tied to the past and to the Old South. W.J. Cash, psychohistorian who wrote a famous book called The Mind of the South, talked about the Southern lady as being a woman up on a pedestal. He talked about this in terms of what he called the Proto-Dorian mode. And some have likened the grandmother to a witch because she has a cat and she's hypocritical, but in terms of manners, she's a recognizable type, a Southern lady. Caroline Compson in The Sound and the Fury, or Amanda Wingfield in The Glass Menagerie come to mind. For example, she wants to wear gloves to ensure her image of being a lady, even if she should meet with some bad fate before they go off on the trip. There again is that irony about fate, but it's also indicative of her manners, as if she needs to reassure herself and others that she's a lady, that there's no common blood in her, which she tries to reassure the misfit. And she also repeatedly tries to save herself by pleading with him, but also by asking him, would you shoot a lady? Her recognition of being a Southern lady is a recognition that Southern ladies have always been iconic figures, have always been put up on this pedestal. And like many Southern ladies, or at least the archetypical figure of a Southern lady, she's full of nostalgia about the old Gone with the Wind South. And it leads her to her memories of the old Southern house where she wants to go and where she will lead the children and Bailey ultimately and herself to their death. Her longing and her nostalgia for the Old South are apparent early on when she uses the word pickaninny to describe a black child. A rather unsatisfactory word, certainly by today's standards, but even by those standards, it was not exactly a word that was used without some tainting of bigotry to it. And she remembers the house with the white columns and a suitor strolling with her through the garden. This is an idyllic, almost what we call prelapsarian, thinking of gardens and Eden and all that, old South memory. I mentioned Tennessee Williams' Amanda Wingfield. Those of you who know the play know that you have a similar Southern lady archetype, but also in The Glass Menagerie, she has all these confabulated memories of the South in the past, of that Gone with the Wind South, darkies serving her, as she calls them, on the veranda and many gentlemen callers. They pass a cotton field and an old family burying ground, inciting more nostalgia and more memory in the grandmother, but also serving like the town with its allegorical name. Its name is Tombsboro, and the misfits hearse-like automobile as presentiments of death. Another story right out of the Old South is a story that the grandmother tells the children about watermelon left by one of her suitors named Edgar A. Teagarden. His initials EAT. And this is right out of the Old South Handbook. Watermelon being associated with blacks, stereotypically. And again, Edgar Teagarden turns out to be a former suitor, and like most of Amanda Wingfield's former suitors, he winds up wealthy. The grandmother, in other words, confabulates the past. She fictionalizes, if you will, the past. She creates her own sense of what the past is, as a Southern lady would create the past. And she also creates another story. It's the story she tells the children, that she craftily tells the children about family silver hidden in a secret panel connected to Sherman's March and, again, the Old South, of course. And the children get all excited, and the children want to look for the treasure and think that they'll find the treasure. And by the way, these children are not very sympathetic characters. They're bratty, they're nasty, but they hardly deserve their fate. And then we have the misfit. He's a killer, but he has manner. And the manners are the earmarks of a Southern gentleman. Grandmother keeps assuring him that he's not common, but he certainly speaks in the vernacular of a common Southerner, of what would vulgarly be called a redneck. But the misfit also, for example, apologizes for not having a shirt on. He greets the family at first with a good afternoon, and he blushes when Bailey uses profanity. That's even after the grandmother recognizes who he is. Later on, in fact, he acknowledges her role as a Southern lady by apologizing for not wearing a shirt. His Southern idiom, however, is common. It's backwoods. He uses words like oncet. They said that the car flipped over twice, and he corrects them by saying oncet. Or he says, and this is a little bit of O'Connor's humor, he was in the armed service, that is ARM. The misfit, however, is a symbol of a character that moves well beyond Southern manner. As I said, you can associate him, as many do, with death. You can associate him with evil. But he's a confused human being as well. And that's how O'Connor wants to portray him, a prophet gone bad. He's a serial killer, too, before their time had come. I mean, now we take serial killers almost as a given in our popular culture. It's from Silence of the Lambs right up to the present, overladen with serial killers. But serial killing, as something we were aware of, I mean, it goes back to Jack the Ripper, but in the United States, it goes back in the South to a figure named Charles Whitman, who was up in a tower shooting people at the University of Texas. Or another Charles Starkweather, who ran off with some young girl and was responsible for a rash of serial killings. Oliver Stone made a whole movie based on their escapades, in fact. And serial killers and mass murderers would appear in the news and on television on the silver screen, until they became so almost commonplace and well-known in popular culture that, believe it or not, there are trading cards of serial killers. Or the kind of jokes where somebody goes out on a blind date and says, well, you're not a serial killer, are you? Many of these stories are reflected in American writers. They would almost become a part of the zeitgeist or the spirit of the time. Joyce Carol Oates' Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? Or Richard Bausch's story, The Man Who Knew Belle Starr, where you have a female serial killer. Or Sandra Cisneros' One Holy Night. But O'Connor was pretty much ahead of this spate of serial killing that we saw in the news and on television. And she portrayed a serial killer who was tortured by his sense of wanting to believe in the absolute, of forgetting what he did or what he may have done as far as the punishments that were meted out to him that were perhaps not fitting the crime. He said at one point in the story, I know the authorities had the papers on me. They put me in the penitentiary, paraphrasing here, but I don't really know what I did, and I did things that I wasn't punished for. He even tells a grandmother at one point that a psychiatrist said he killed his father. But he says he knows he didn't kill his father, raising the whole question of whether patricide might have been actually part of the misfit's personal history. It's easy to see why O'Connor wanted to paint him, if you will, as a prophet gone bad. And it's also easy to see why he's been more identified as a satanic figure or a killer in a backwoods drama, in a Georgia which is full of mystery and evil associated with that mystery. One thinks about the rape and sodomizing scene that was brought to film out of James Dickey's novel, Deliverance. James Dickey at one time was the poet laureate of the United States. He was also a Georgia-born poet and novelist. And it's a good example of the kind of violence and palpable evil that those from Georgia feel sometimes they can get at in their work. You see reflected in novelists and writers like Dickey and O'Connor. The misfit goes along a journey or a trajectory in this story as well. He goes through changes just as a grandmother does. At first he says, no pleasure but meanness, but following his shooting the grandmother to death, he says to one of his henchmen, his comrades, there's no pleasure in life. There are a lot of other elements in this story. It's a rich and multi-fabric story. It's a lot of dark humor. There's a good deal of it throughout. One of the finer and more understated examples is when the grandmother notes inwardly to herself that she will not mention that the house she had been thinking about was in Tennessee. There's also the sense of the grotesque, a word that's often singularly identified with Flannery O'Connor's work, though it goes back in terms of its pedigree, if you will, in American literature to Sherwood Anderson, who wrote a book of the grotesque in his collection, Winesburg, Ohio. O'Connor likened her fiction more to the literal quality associated with a child's drawing, and that made a host of critics jump aboard to this word grotesque, which really in many ways does descriptively define a lot of her work. So does the word Gothic. It's another descriptive term that's often applied to this story and others by O'Connor because, well, the sinister, gloomy, mysterious quality and the violent content, which also links us again, at least in American literature and the short story, to Young Goodman Brown by Nathaniel Hawthorne. And this is a parable of good and evil. Again, like Hawthorne, like Shirley Jackson, anchored in violence, with parallels also to Isaac Babel's My First Goose and Hemingway's The Killers. And we get back to the title, Red Sammy lamenting better times in the past when you could leave your screen door unlatched and you knew who to trust. Is O'Connor making a direct kind of comment on the contemporary world that she's living in? I think so. In fact, remember that this story came along at that perch of time when the lottery came after the Second World War, when there was an entirely different sense of evil in the world than had existed previously. The misfit, by any conventional standards, would be identified with evil, but the grandmother says she knows that he's a good man. He denies it. He uses the word good at the end of the story to indicate what the grandmother might have been if someone were around to shoot her at every minute of her life. Thereby he becomes a prophet, perhaps of the nature of what grace is. But if the story is taking us into this whole mysterious dimension theologically of good and evil, it leaves us with, as so many great stories do, a lot of ambiguity. Just like there's a sense in the story that you can read it with a very Catholic reading, as O'Connor intended and wanted, or you could read it, as I said, as a story really that harkens us back to the sense of nothingness and of evil being so capricious. These people tend down the wrong road and they wind up dead. Or did they tend down the wrong road? Was there some kind of fate guiding them? Because from the beginning of the story, the grandmother talks about trying to avoid the misfit and her death. There are a lot of other characters in the story. I want to talk about them at least briefly. There's the children's mother, who is an enigmatic character in many ways. She's portrayed as having a cabbage face and a rabbit-looking ears and as being utterly passive, ineffectually deferential. She answers, "Yes, thank you," after the misfit asks her to step over yonder with his two cronies, who were two Fussell-like characters, Hiram and Bobby Lee. By the way, Fussell is a word that Henry James gave us. It's a character who is in a story simply to move the action forward, who isn't really necessary part of the story or doesn't move the plot forward. It comes from Henry James, and these two characters exemplify what Fussells are. There's Bailey, the grandmother's son. He says ominously, after being goaded by the children to stop, this is the one and only time. As ironic in its way as his daughter June Starr expressing disappointment following the accident that no one is dead. His shirt plays a central role in its conspicuousness and the fact that the grandmother, later in the story, is so stunned that she cannot even say what the shirt reminds her of. And it's this rather garish and, as I said, conspicuous shirt. The children, John Wesley and June Starr, nasty, spoiled kids. Their names appear to be ironic. It's almost as if Flannery O'Connor is having some fun with us. John Wesley was a Christian theologian, one of the founders of the Methodist religion. June Starr, well, a name which combines one of the season's most pleasant months with the stellar. It's almost a sense of, as I say, maybe ridicule, or something certainly bordering on ridicule, coming from O'Connor with these names. One shouldn't always take names seriously in stories. One of my mentors, Walter Tevis, whom I mentioned in the first lecture about Poe, said he used to open the phone book, he'd take one name, and then he'd open the phone book and take another name. And yet, stories particularly that are allegorical and stories that have meaning that can be attached to names, even though many times you find yourself with red herrings, at least elicit certain kinds of identifications which are and can be important. I even think about the name Bailey, for example. It's a funny name. It makes me think of the old song, "Won't You Come Home, Bill Bailey?" And Bill Bailey doesn't come home. At least this Bailey doesn't come home. And then there's Red Sammy of the Tower. This mean to his wife advertising veteran appears as a kind of stock Southern character, identified with the title as well as the monkey chained to a small chinaberry tree that catches fleas and eats them. And we wonder, what's this doing in the story? If we mention James and Fussells, we might as well think of James and the figure in the carpet. Why do we suddenly have a monkey in there? Well, eating fleas. The tableau suggests a kind of reverse Darwinian evolution. Those who eat in the tower and the monkey who eats outside of it. And again, you can feel the rather humorous and sometimes ridiculing hand of Flannery O'Connor, who was a dark humorist in many respects, who wrote stories which sometimes make us laugh out loud. I'll give you an example of an O'Connor story. It's well known, called Good Country People. And there again, these good country people turn out to be very sinister in many ways. And underneath this one character, who appears to be nothing but a common sort of dumb character, is a con man and someone who induces a young woman who's got a PhD in philosophy and who thinks she's very bright and thinks he's very common and naive into going with him up in an attic. She, it turns out, has a wooden leg, and he asks her to take off her wooden leg and show it to him. And he gets right at the heart of her being with this request. And she's very touched by it. She gives it to him, and he runs off with it as a souvenir. And O'Connor has written about this story as being, well, not only about good country people and what they really represent and all that, what's underneath the surfaces again, but also about the inevitability, when she wrote the story, of his taking the wooden leg and running with it. She was quite ill. when she wrote this story. Good man is hard to find. She had lupus. And the story itself was influenced by a couple of newspaper stories, but let me just say about her lupus that, and we've seen this in a number of our short story writers, the sickness certainly affected her vision, I'm sure, that is her sensibility and her sense of the world, even though she had her faith right up until the end and was managed to cleave to it up until the end. Nevertheless, you could argue, and some have, that writing stories from this sensibility of a woman who had inherited lupus, who knew she was going to die at a young age, could have a lot to do with her art. The story came from a small-time thief who called himself the Misfit, and a bandit and kidnapper who called himself a gentleman bandit. The Misfit wound up in a mental asylum, and O'Connor once described her town of Milledgeville, which had one of the world's largest mental hospitals, as a town of 8,000 of whom 4,000 were locked up. It's an intricate story, but it's a plainly told story. It doesn't include didacticism, but what it does embrace is Catholic theology and grace. And perhaps the most ambiguous image is of that image we get of the grandmother lying with 3 riddled bullets in a puddle of blood, looking up at the heavens with a smile on her face. Clearly, if we can find intention, we can find it there, the intention of grace. While O'Connor was making a major impact on the short story, there was nothing singular about her stories, or Shirley Jackson's, or other women writers that could be labeled as distinctive of a female voice. Her influence on other writers was wide, but the singularity of change to a distinct and feminist-minded woman's voice in short fiction was something that would take place later on. You could do a linguistic study of Flannery O'Connor's short fiction, or many of the other short story women writers. Eudora Welty would be another good example, who also comes from the South, from the Mississippi Delta, in fact. And you could look at their work, and you would be hard-pressed to see that they are women writers. I mean, what is it, after all, that distinguishes a woman's writing from a man's writing, particularly at a time when many of the women writers were trying to find a voice that would be universally acceptable, that would have the kind of general acceptance that men's voices had. Flannery O'Connor was much less concerned with gender than she was with her Catholicism. Shirley Jackson was probably less concerned with gender than she was with an anthropological view of humankind and casting a voice which really cast a big net as far as omniscient voices go. Where we see this take a turn is after O'Connor, and we see it take a turn with Grace Paley, a very distinct voice, a writer who was political-minded, feminist to the core in many ways, and feminist in a way that was really almost hearkening to the kind of feminism that would come with the next wave. Remember that Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique at a time when women really played these very confined roles. Think about the grandmother in terms of how she sums up in so many ways the identity of a Southern lady, and then think about the children's mother, who has no name, who is utterly anonymous, who simply goes along deferentially. And you begin to see O'Connor giving us a view of women that, by feminist standards, is disturbing. Unless, of course, you'd want to switch it over and say, well, what it really means is O'Connor is showing us that women have been constricted by these roles and straitjacketed by them. And that's really perhaps a kind of unconscious feminism on O'Connor's part. Well, I think that may be a stretch. I think that O'Connor, like so many writers before Grace Paley, were writers for the most part, and I'm talking about women writers now, were women writers who weren't necessarily that mindful of or conscious of the fact that they could portray women in ways that were singularly identifiable with a woman's identity. Yes, we see that to some extent in Catherine Mansfield, but it's still an omniscient voice. It's still as if we're taken into that girl's mind as well as the mind of all of those around her. And that's different than what we'll see in Paley. What we see in Paley is a woman's voice in short fiction which is distinct, which is stylistically linked only to that woman and her point of view. Remember, we've seen points of view which go all over the place in their omniscience, and where the voice is authentic too. We travel to the East Coast of the United States to get that point of view in the next story up for our consideration, written by really one of the first and strongest of the world's women short story writers, although I can't in any way overstate the importance of Flannery O'Connor on the short story in general. And you're beginning to see this burgeoning influence of women writers, and you see it from a particularly womanist, is a word that Alice Walker used, perspective, with Grace Paley's publication of The Little Disturbances of Man, and a story that we go to next called An Interest in Life.